very heartening. They receive it as a blessing that George Floyd's life mattered to more than just them. It is very important to note who George was. There are videos on social media that George believed in peaceful protest. Brandon Williams, who was George's nephew, who was like a father to Brandon, said that they talked almost every day, and during the Ferguson protests, during the Baltimore protests, and just recently during the Sacramento protests, you had George Floyd praying for peaceful protests. You know, the forensic scientists, Dr. Michael Biden and Dr. Alicia Wilson, who did the family's autopsy, said that George died because he needed a breath. And so I am imploring, along with George Floyd's family, for all of us to take a breath. For peace, let's take a breath. For justice, let's take a breath to heal our country. And most importantly, let's take a breath for George Floyd as we get ready to memorialize him this week and lay him to his final rest on next Tuesday. Let's take a breath this week to heal the country and to remember George. Let's follow George's example. He would have wanted peaceful protests. He wants everybody to use their voice, but he wants them to do it in a constructive way. So as we get ready to memorialize him on tomorrow at North Central University with all his family, I also want us to remember that Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was executed in the sanctity of her own home in Louisville, Kentucky, birthday would be on Friday. So let's take a breath for Breonna as well. Let's take a breath for Ahmaud Arbery as well. Let's take a breath for Terrence Crutcher as well. Let's take a breath for Pamela Turner, who was killed in Houston. Let's take a breath for Alton Sterling, who was killed in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Let's take a breath for Philando Castile, who was killed here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Let's take a breath for Laquan McDonald, who was killed in Chicago, Illinois. Let's take a breath for Sandra Bland, who was killed in Texas. Let's take a breath for Natasha McKinney, who was killed by police in Virginia. Let's take a breath for Stephon Clark, who was killed in Sacramento, California. Let's take a breath for Corey Jones, who was killed in Palm Beach, Florida. Let's take a breath for Botham Jones, who was killed in his own apartment in Dallas, Texas. Let's take a breath for Eric Gardner, who was killed in Staten Island, New York. Let's take a breath for Freddie Gray, who was killed in Baltimore, Maryland. Let's take a breath for Walter Scott, who was killed in South Carolina. Let's take a breath for Jamar Clark, who was killed here in Minneapolis. Let's take a breath for Let's take a breath for Michael Brown, who was killed in Ferguson. Let's take a breath for 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was killed in Cleveland, Ohio by the police. Let's take a breath for Trayvon Benjamin Martin, who was killed in Sanford, Florida. Let's take a breath for Emmett Till, who was killed in Mississippi. Let's take a breath collectively for all of the marginalized and disenfranchised and dehumanized people, whether black, brown, white, or red, who were killed unjustifiably, who were killed unnecessarily, and who was killed senselessly, because they are American citizens, one, they are human beings, two, and finally, we should all remember they are children of God. Thank you so much. We will respond to you when we get the announcements.